Thank you so much for joining us today. This webinar will last approximately 1 hour with a presentation followed by a Q&A. And all participants will remain muted, so feel free to send in any questions to the chat Q&A, and I will collect them to answer after the presentation. You're welcome to turn on your cameras or keep them turned off. We'll also launch a quick poll at the end. So Dr. Xin Sun is lecturer in Chinese and East Asian business at the Lao China Institute and King's Business School, King's College London. Prior to joining King's, he held academic positions at University of Oxford and Trinity College Dublin. Dr. Sun studied at Northwestern University between 2008 and 2014, obtaining a PhD in political science and serving as graduate research fellow at Institute of Policy Research. He obtained a bachelor degree in chemistry and economics from Peking University. Dr. Sun's research interests include political economy, state business relations, and rural and urban development in China. His current research examines how the Chinese Communist Party utilizes and constantly tailors an extractive property rights regime to generate and distribute patronage and economic rents among political elites, as well as the impacts of such politically driven land use practices on social conflict and long-term regime stability. His latest publications have appeared in Journal of Public Policy, Political Studies, Problems of Post-Communism, the China Journal, and the World Development.
Okay, thank you so much, Anna. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me clearly? Great, great. Thank you again, Anna. I remember last year at this time, we were actually sitting in the classroom of Peking University in China talking about the issues on Chinese political economy. Mm-hmm. The world has changed so much since then, and I'm so glad to see you're doing well. Everyone is doing well. Also, I want to express my appreciation to the Global Learning Office and the Buffett Institute for this precious opportunity to get reconnected with Northwestern community. And thank you all for coming. Undoubtedly, the pandemic has significant impacts on everyone's health, income, lifestyle, and our relationship with others. I'm sure over the past few months, you have heard many stories and arguments about how the pandemic has become a game changer in so many ways. As a scholar on China, I have been thinking about how this pandemic, what this pandemic means for Chinese politics and the economy. So let me begin with a graph that you have probably seen quite a few times in the past few months. This is a number of deaths attributed to COVID-19 among selected countries, including United States, UK, China, India, etc., Japan, etc., etc. And when we, what people do here is to compare the performance in controlling the pandemic across different countries. So when we look at this figure, clearly two patterns have emerged. First, China as an authoritarian regime and the initial epicenter of the pandemic has outperformed many developed democratic countries across the world, and even richer countries, in terms of flattening the curve more rapidly and more effectively. And second, there also exists a large variation across different democratic countries, with United States and the UK unfortunately performing very poorly. And on the other hand, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan doing a much better job. The fact that China as a middle-income authoritarian country outperformed the US and Europe has triggered a very hot debate on public and social media and among China pundits and scholars. Some argue that China's effective response to the pandemic once again demonstrated the merits of the country's regime compared with Western democracies. Last time it was 2008 financial crisis when the Chinese government seems to have a better performance in sustaining the economy. Both these crises gave rise to widespread confidence in the merits of the Chinese model of governance, or the so-called China model, compared with the governance model based on democratic institutions and rule of law. For example, in the meeting with the Chinese President Xi Jinping, the Director General of World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, reportedly said the Chinese government's response to the outbreak showcased China's speed, China's scale, and China's efficiency. And this is the advantage of China's system worthy for other countries to learn from. So given this widespread optimism, in the following 35 minutes, I'd like to share my view on this so-called China model. I'll discuss more specifically what exactly the China model is, and how did it work during the pandemic, and the role of the model in Chinese economic development, and finally, my 2 cents on how the model could inform us about China's future. Okay, so in my opinion, the China model, or the Chinese model of governance, has 3 major features: authoritarianism, political centralization, and a strong state capacity. So here, authoritarianism refers to the relationship between the state and the society. More specifically, it means the intrusive state governing a largely unorganized society. The governing an unorganized society with limited respect of civil liberties and individual rights. Political centralization here refers to the internal structure of the polity, meaning that lower level officials are appointed by party leaders and derive their power from the authorization of the center. And the final feature refers to the capacity of the state, especially in terms of fiscal resources and an effective bureaucracy that gets policy implemented. Okay. So these 2 features, it should be noted that the last feature, the strong state capacity, it's a necessary condition for any effective governance, both in democratic or authoritarian contexts. So what makes the China model so unique are really the first 2 features of authoritarianism and the political centralization. And I argue these 2 features actually played a key role in China's response to the pandemic. For example, the authoritarian feature allowed the government to quickly adopt a whole range of, as you have heard from media reports, draconian measures to impose isolation, quarantine, and tracing, etc., etc. These measures, for example, include forced quarantine, with local officials blocking the homes of those under self-isolation, using alarms or even surveillance camera to enforce. And for those who had displayed symptoms or traveling from high-risk areas, the standard practice adopted in China was to put people under concentrated quarantine, most often at their own expenses. Chinese students who studied abroad and returned to China in recent months are all too well aware of this, right? The government also, since the very beginning, required rigorous masks wearing in public space and imposed a very strict enforcement, such as fine or arrests. Another measure is to use the so-called health code mobile apps to track and trace people with higher risks. These apps collect the personal information about people's movements and contacts and use this information and algorithm to calculate individual risk of infection. Those who got judged as having a higher risk were often denied travel, denied access to public space and services. And these apps are developed by the governments, sometimes in collaboration with giant IT companies from China, such as Alibaba and Tencent. But these companies share the data with the government anyway. Right? So when we examine these draconian measures, it becomes clear that they are highly intrusive and restrictive, and they infringe upon civil liberties and individual rights. But they prove to be extremely effective in controlling the pandemic. In the end of the day, many democratic countries have adopted similar measures, but in a more moderate and a cautious manner. A recent research conducted by political scientist Adam Chwosky and the co-authors, they find that on average, it took democracies much longer time to adopt similar measures. And many eventually managed to do it only after the high death toll, which arguably strengthened consensus among citizens. In England, for example, when the self-isolation and the 2-meter social distancing rules were adopted, they immediately triggered intense media discussion about how such rules should be enforced and what role the police should play in the enforcement when people violate these rules. In the end, the enforcement was never very strict, and much less coercion was involved in the enforcement compared with China. The same controversy emerged again when this week the UK government required mask wearing in all shops and other public space. But still, these government officials were very reluctant to make the requirement a formal law and call upon the police to enforce it rigorously. The hope, in my opinion, of the government, the British government, is that the business themselves should adopt a voluntary enforcement by themselves. So in my opinion, the contrast between China and democracies in their performance in controlling the pandemic pretty much boils down to how these countries treated civil liberties and rights. In China, all these above mentioned measures were simply imposed and implemented by the government very quickly. And it would be difficult to imagine a democratic countries with entrenched civil liberties could do the same before some sort of consensus is formed, which makes the responses extremely slow, as you all noticed in the United States. Of course, people may argue some other factors may also play a role, like the competence of different leaders or the ideology of different political parties. But to me, the most important factor behind is how the government treated people's liberties and how social resistance and public opinion play a role in shaping government behavior. Remember, the second feature of the China model is political centralization. This, in my opinion, also played a very important role in shaping the government's response to the pandemic. All local governments across the whole country acted like under a wartime mobilization, in China. Within less than 24 hours of the Wuhan lockdown, all other 16 cities in Hubei province imposed the lockdown as well. And within less than 2 weeks, cities in almost half of the country were already under lockdown. Some of these cities were in fact only very lightly affected, with less than a dozen cases by the end of the pandemic. So far, But this didn't prevent local officials from adopting very dramatic measures from the very beginning, since the central government, especially President Xi, took the pandemic as a top priority. As you can see from these pictures, local governments closed the highways to deny travelers from other regions. They ordered hotels not to accept any guests from Hubei province or any other high-risk areas, leaving many travelers to have nowhere to stay. In the rural area, local officials even cut off roads and set up checkpoints and roadblocks to deny access to outsiders. How can we explain the extraordinary effort devoted by local officials, not just in Wuhan and Hubei, the epicenter of the pandemic, but across the whole country? The answer lies in the political centralization feature of the China model. Under political centralization, especially when power is highly concentrated in the hands of President Xi, local officials all sought to demonstrate their best effort and performance in accomplishing what Xi had ordered them to do. That is, flattening the curve and controlling the pandemic. As a result, fighting the pandemic became essentially a tournament among local government officials. And a weak performance would make local officials appear disloyal to Xi, or at least incompetent. This also explains why local officials didn't dare to relax the draconian measures or lockdown until it was absolutely safe to do it. In the end, I mean, the tournament, sorry, this is a picture when the rural government officials cut off the roads and set up roadblocks to deny access from outsiders. So in the end, this tournament generated two broad impacts. It provided ultra strong political incentives for local officials to control and fight the pandemic, but they also encouraged practice such as overreacting, wasting a lot of resources, causing too much disruption, underreporting the number of cases. And also, as you can see from these pictures, there is clearly a not in my backyard mentality among local governments. And this has seriously undermined the coherence of the whole Chinese government's response. So far, we have explored how the key features of the China model, authoritarianism and the political centralization, contributed strongly to China's success in fighting the pandemic. However, a close examination suggested that this model, it's probably not quite so much a miracle. It's probably not as successful as many people have believed. I will argue it is exactly the same features of the model, authoritarianism and the political centralization, especially the latter, that have led to the escalation of the crisis in the first place and have incurred significant political costs on the regime. To understand this, I want to first remind everybody that China experienced another pandemic just 17 years ago. It was in 2003, the SARS pandemic. It was another coronavirus. At that time, the Chinese government, the government's failure to respond in a timely and transparent manner have triggered a widespread, a huge public outcry. After SARS, many of us assumed that the Chinese government has learned some lesson from its past failure and should have developed a better system to deal with an outbreak like this. But still, this time again, the government responded extremely slowly without transparency at the early stage. As a result, the outbreak almost turned into another regime destabilizing crisis. I still vividly remembered that in early January, many of my friends and the people discussed this pandemic about the policy of it turning to the Chernobyl moment for the Chinese regime. So the question is, why did the failure happen again? Despite the experience just 17 years ago. So let's travel back a little to see the timeline of events. Since last November and December, hospitals in Wuhan had found patients of unknown pneumonia that is potentially infectious. The Wuhan government reported this potential outbreak to the central government as early as in December, but it didn't publicize any news about the pneumonia. On January the 3rd, Wuhan government released an official statement to the public claiming and acknowledging the pneumonia, but argued there is no evidence that it is infectious. In fact, when several whistleblowers, including the hospital doctor Li Wenliang, who later got infected in the front line and died, shared, these whistleblowers shared internal government documents about the suspected outbreak on social media on December the 30th. They were accused by the local police of spreading rumor and received admonishment. The most mysterious thing happened during the 2 weeks between January the 3rd and the 20th, as you can see here. The public received no official information whatsoever, except for the Wuhan government's daily reports of extremely small number of confirmed cases, and sometimes even 0 on many days. In the meantime, the Wuhan government kept stating the pneumonia was non-infectious and didn't take any measure at all. Public events were convened with no warnings. Both the central government and the local governments acted as if nothing had happened. Remember during the same period, there had been reports about confirmed cases among travelers to Wuhan from other countries, Japan, South Korea, and Thailand. When the central government finally acknowledged the outbreak more than 2 weeks later on January the 20th, followed by the lockdown of Wuhan just 2 days later, you can imagine how confused, how angry, and how panicked the public was. Now we understand, these 2 weeks in the earliest stage of the outbreak was critical, not only for China, but also for the whole world. If the Chinese government responded faster, the outbreak might be better contained and the damage might be limited to some extent. At least if the government handles the information in a more transparent manner, citizens could make better preparation by avoiding public events or contacts with people. They could make better preparation. But no, from the perspective of the Chinese public, the few weeks before the lockdown were totally wasted, and they were all kept in the darkness about the outbreak. Why did this happen? My argument is that it is the very nature of the Chinese governance model, the so-called China model, and more specifically, the centralized decision-making process that has caused the delay and the mismanagement at this early stage. We know that Wuhan government reported the suspected outbreak to the central government as early as in December. Ideally, the central government could have asked the Wuhan government to take some locally based containment or precautious measures, or to provide better transparency and warnings to local population. But no, this is not how how things work in the Chinese political system. The logic is like this. In China's centralized regime, party leaders and the central government, they never truly trust the local officials. And such distrust is actually deeply entrenched. And it is perfectly legitimate, reasonable, because imagine if local officials have too much power and resources, there's no guarantee that they wouldn't use them against the interest of the party center and its national leaders. And the powerful local officials could well become political challengers, especially during crisis. Party leaders in China like Xi Jinping, they all remembered how Boris Yeltsin, the Moscow mayor of the former Soviet Union, brought down the communist regime and became the first president of non-communist Russia. To avoid defection, President Xi and other party leaders needed to make sure they fully control the power and the resources available to local officials at all times. To make sure local officials always need central authorization to do anything beyond their normal jobs. To make sure without authorization, local officials can't mobilize forces, especially the military. However, this normal system is designed for normal time. It's designed to curb the discretion and the power of local officials, but it is not suitable under a crisis, including social uprising, natural disaster, or a pandemic. Handling a crisis requires local officials to have concentrated power, have the authority to mobilize massive resources that is normally beyond their reach. For example, facing the pandemic, local officials may need the power to deploy military to impose the lockdown, to help with logistics or transportation, and to maintain social order. They may also need extra institutional authority to expropriate resources from other parts of the regime, like the universities or state-owned enterprises, or even the private sector, to meet emergency needs. Now, I want everyone to assume that you are President Xi, and local officials reported to you a new outbreak has occurred. But it's not entirely clear how large the scale is and how contagious it is. How should you respond? How should you respond? Okay. If you immediately authorize local officials with extra institutional power and resources, ask them to adopt the precautions and the containment measures, how can you trust that local officials will not use this power and resources against your own interests? Maybe they use the power to plot something against yourself, perhaps in collusion with someone in the central government as well. Plus, how could you be sure the crisis is serious enough to justify the authorization of the additional power and resources? After all, local officials could have lied about the magnitude of the crisis. But alternatively, if you do not act immediately, the crisis may very easily get escalated very quickly. So facing this dilemma, as well as a lot of uncertainty about the nature of the pandemic, the best you can do is to send teams of experts to verify the information reported by your local officials. Note that here I use teams of experts, not a team of experts. Yes, that's right, because you never know whether a single team could collude with local officials and lie to you about the nature of the pandemic. Okay. In fact, during the period between early January and the Wuhan lockdown, the central government sent at least 2 teams of experts to Wuhan to verify independently the information reported by the local officials. And these causing significant delay in taking effective measures. Okay, what I have just presented was a much simplified story, and the actual political logic behind could be much more complicated. But the key takeaway point here is that the Chinese governance model is designed in a way that power is highly concentrated and the local discretion is highly curbed and fragmented. This design prevented a decentralized but precautious solution, and this delayed effective response. And the slow and ineffective early response eventually led to the escalation of the pandemic to a level that caused significant political damages to the regime and to Xi Jinping's personal prestige. And this logic explains why China repeated the same mistake 17 years later. And the same logic also applies for other crisis situations, such as social uprising, the massive flooding China has been experiencing nowadays, and situations like Chernobyl. The China model, as demonstrated in this pandemic, also incurred very high implementation costs. As we have seen, not only doctors, but also other state employees, such as university professors, state firm employees, government officials, and even ordinary party members were all mobilized to help implement and enforce the draconian measures, as you can see from these pictures. The implementation was extremely labor intensive. Many temporary staff were hired. In the first months of the pandemic, the Wuhan city itself alone have hired 50,000 temporary workers, the so-called volunteers, conducting community-based services, such as helping with quarantine enforcement, monitor, etc., etc. But they were actually hired and paid by the government. To be sure, the cost of this may be worth paying since the economic benefit of a successful response, right? The economic benefit could be so huge. But as we discussed earlier, many local governments maintained unnecessary lockdown and other draconian measures for weeks or even months, even if they only had like a dozen of confirmed cases. You know, my own research also suggests that in many other policy areas in China, the inefficient use of such administrative resources could be very serious and could have much less justifiable benefits. Also, the draconian measures, as we have just seen, have serious consequences on individual well-being. Especially during the early stage of the lockdown, public transportation were unavailable and the people who need healthcare had to walk hours to the hospital to get treated. Many travelers were stranded in their trips only to find they were denied by hotels and not allowed to return home either. Citizens from high-risk areas faced severe discrimination, not just the implicit, but also explicit, not just by fellow citizens, but also systematically by the government authorities and policies. All these consequences are very hard to measure, but they indeed existed and may cause a long-term impact on how victims view the regime. Now we have seen how the China model works during the pandemic. Let's then shift the topic a little bit to examine how the same model works in the economy. Interestingly, the way how the model works in economy is extremely similar with the case of the pandemic. Under authoritarianism, individual liberties and rights are heavily restricted and even suppressed. But ironically, such restrictions and suppression contributed strongly to economic growth. For example, the government provided low welfare and social benefit to a large chunk of the population, especially the migrant workers. And Anna and Sophie, if you remember last summer, we interviewed many migrant workers on campus and in Beijing to talk about what kind of a welfare they received from either workspace, from employers or the government. And it's actually very little, very limited, right? And the government labor rights are often weakly enforced. Independent labor organizations like unions are not allowed. Pollution were tolerated and environmental laws were not strongly enforced for decades. Rural land is expropriated with low compensation to make way for urbanization and industrial development. Financial repression is imposed to artificially lower the cost of financing investment at the expenses of depositors. And the capital control is adopted to risk the freedom of capital flow. I argue it is precisely this, because the suppression of these civil and the property rights and individual freedom, China could have developed an extremely efficient private sector, gain a huge cost advantage in manufacturing, and become the world factory. Besides authoritarianism, political centralization also plays a key role in the China model of development. When the party center is fully committed to economic growth, local officials across the whole country acted as if in a tournament. Again, they compete with each other in building infrastructure, in attracting investment. They're offering land and tax breaks to investors, to businesses, and help firms deal with environmental and labor disputes. Taken together, how the China model works in practice in economy can be clearly seen in the case of Foxconn. This is the largest supplier of Apple. With the suppression of labor, land, and environmental costs under the aid by local and central governments, Foxconn becomes an extremely effective and efficient manufacturing and export machine. However, besides this more efficient side, Chinese economy also has an extremely inefficient side, which sows the seeds of instability. When local officials respond to the powerful political incentives to generate growth, they also spend a tremendous amount of resources on projects with very low returns. This hotel, for example, was part of the urban infrastructure built by a county government in a poor western province. The county has about like 500,000 population, but so far it has accumulated over $6 billion of debt. They borrowed heavily from state-owned banks to build projects like this. Of course, many local officials, when doing this, hoped to reap future payoff from like the real estate sector. But the real estate sector, as you can see from these pictures, I mean, these are pictures from the so-called ghost towns. The real estate sector in China is already a huge bubble, with price-income ratio much higher compared with OECD countries, and of course, other developing countries as well, and with rental yield much lower. In other words, it can be safely argued that the price of real estate in China has deviated tremendously from the fundamental value, and the price growth is largely sustained by speculative forces and loose monetary policy by the government. As a result of the government investment impulse and the decades-long real estate bubble, the Chinese economy has become heavily indebted. Its debt level is now comparable with United States and Europe, probably only lower than Japan, as you see. I mean, the axis on the left is the number for all other countries except Japan, and the vertical axis on the right is the number for Japan. So apparently, the debt level in China has already approaching extremely similar with the level in most countries in Europe and the United States, only behind the case of Japan. But what makes debt in China extremely dangerous is, on the one hand, we see the rapid accumulation of debt since 2008. Most of the debt that we observe in China, as you again see from the picture, in 2008, the debt level in China is it's only like 150% of its GDP, but now it reaches to over 250%. Right, the extremely rapid growth is very, very worrying. And the second, China has a more fragile banking sector where much of the financial risk is concentrated. So it is highly possible that China has avoided a debt crisis so far only because it imposed very tight control over capital outflow. But historical experiences in many other countries suggested that capital control may not be all that effective. Okay. So far, we have seen the several pros and cons of the so-called China model. It achieved formidable growth record with surprised the rights and the costs through the highly competitive private sector. But way more problematic is the inefficient state sector with growth driven by investment and heavy debt. Also problematic is the unmeasured but serious social consequences that are associated with this China model that leads to potential instability. So taken together, let me wrap up. The above discussions on COVID-19 and the economy, I would argue the so-called China model is really a double-edged sword. It has admirable effectiveness in achieving some development and governance objectives by rapid mobilization of resources, by rapid mobilization of officials' efforts with very powerful political incentives, and very importantly, the suppression of liberties, rights, and welfare. But the model is far from being so admirable as many have believed. It is highly rigid. as we have seen in the COVID-19 case. It is highly inefficient, with the concentration of power preventing a more rapid and better tailored solution to many government problems, with its national mobilization inducing distorted incentives and practices, and with eventually the extra high economic and social cost that limits the model's sustainability. Therefore, a fundamental dilemma faced by this China model in the future, I mean, in my opinion, is declining economic growth reduces fiscal resources available to the regime. As you can see, since the 2008 financial crisis, China has been experiencing a declining growth rates, and this is now widely accepted as a long-term trend. Okay, but the way the Chinese regime governs is extremely expensive. It keeps generating an escalating governance crisis like the COVID-19. In the end of the day, the regime has to rely on its powerful mobilization of resources to solve all these problems. But what if the regime runs low on resources? What happens if the government does not have enough money to buy off, to solve these problems? The declining fiscal affluence of the states perhaps also forces elites to be more extractive, which generates further discontent and a crisis. This is what I believe to be a fundamental dilemma faced by the so-called China model in the future. And finally, the centralized regime with highly concentrated power is far from being cohesive politically. At the peak of the pandemic, many political and economic elites in China have voiced sharp disagreement against how the government under Xi Jinping treated the crisis and treated the economy. On the left picture, you see a famous real estate developer, Genji Chou. He's also a princeling who have extensive connections within the cohort of political elites. He wrote an extremely acrimonious piece to criticize Xi Jinping during the pandemic. Even Premier Li Keqiang on the red picture, and officially the number 2 of the party, implicitly criticized the government's handling of economic policies during the crisis. These voices of disagreement got muted very quickly, as you can imagine, in the media environment in China, very tightly controlled. But they revealed a deep-seated split among the party's ruling elites. And during the pandemic, this split surfaced from below and become more explicit. They could serve in the future as a focal point where opponents of the regime may actually, rally around. As we have seen repeatedly in the history, the combination of elite split and a legitimate crisis probably are most detrimental to the survival of authoritarian regimes. And to this, China is no exception. Okay, so that's all my presentation. And thank you so much for your patience. And I look forward to your comments and questions.
Yeah, so Maxine and I are going to be facilitating Q&A. Well, I'll just start with the first question we got. Yep. So in the beginning of the pandemic, it seemed that the local Wuhan government displayed hesitation to act upon the reports from the frontline health workers and work to repress these reports. So how does that situation of local repression of this new outbreak fit into the China model? And is it anticipated that a shift might happen in the China model to further avoid a repeat of this?
My opinion, as actually we discussed this a little bit in the presentation, but I argue this is essentially a political problem. The local government were reluctant to adopt any cautious measures, and they didn't want to release any public information about the potential pandemic. It's because they're waiting for the political authorization from the central government. Without this authorization, they will be perceived by Xi Jinping and by the party center as disloyal, right? If without the authorization, if they release the information about the pandemic, if they do any sort of mobilization, they will be perceived as disloyal. And the local officials do whatever they can to avoid this. So this is how they actually shifted the responsibility to the local government and waited until the order coming down from the very top. And this political consideration caused a significant delay, right? And because the political consideration is always here, you know, in the future, it will still exist. This is why, you know, the government hasn't essentially learned anything. I mean, they developed a very fancy system to allow local hospitals to report potential epidemic to the central CDC, right? But still, they need time to, they need to wait for the authorization, right? This can also happen in many other crisis situations, as I just mentioned, you know, natural disasters, you know, in order to deal with the flooding, you know, to protect the people, to mobilize resources to protect the people from the flooding, local officials, they also need some sort of authorization from the central government. That's why we see a lot of mismanagement and misbehavior, especially at earlier stage of crisis dealing in China.
Thank you, Dr. Sun. So the next question is, what causes the lack of trust between President Xi and the local government officials, which led the president to hesitate before giving them resources to handle the pandemic locally? And by contrast, the comparison is President Trump instead placed the burden of decision on his state governors, although President Trump may not necessarily trust the US state governors more than President Xi trusts his local leaders.
Yeah, we clearly see there are, this is a great question. We clearly see there is distrust both in the American context and in the Chinese context. But you know, the luxury for American citizens or American situation is that even though there is this mistrust, but the system itself is organized in a highly institutionalized manner. You know, the division of authority is clearly specified in the Constitution and as different laws. So local governments clearly know it is their own responsibility and it's their discretion and authority to deploy precautious measures or containment measures. Donald Trump, you know, he can say about a lot of things, but eventually, you know, the responsibility lies in the hands of governors, state governments. The problem in China is more deep-seated. The mistrust between, not only between central government and local government, but also actually the distrust is everywhere within the polity. You know, between Xi Jinping and his most close comrades, between him and his colleagues, even between him and the number 2 people, Li Keqiang, premier of the regime, right? And why this distrust happened is because in authoritarian regimes, unlike in democracies where there is institutionalized manner to handle political disagreement, you know, you have elections every 4 years. You know, in democracies, national decision makers and executive gets elected. You know, this is quite certain. But in China, there's no such certainty. Anyone within the regime could become a potential challenger and could pose very severe challenge to the political survival of President Xi himself. This is why such distrust is deeply seated, and it could never be overcome without a better system of institutionalization, like routine elections, right? And so far, we haven't seen communist regimes everywhere in the world could come up with a better solution to this trust issue, to this you know, lack of institutionalization issue. And this is, again, why I believe the same kind of a problem will happen again and again in the future.
So another question we received was, do you believe that the economic implications of the China model are replicable? How much of China's success do you think can be attributed to the timing of its development during an increase of foreign investment?
It is replicable, and it is both replicable and not replicable. It depends on the local context. It depends on which country we are talking about. I mean, in most democratic countries, even in many undeveloped democracies in Africa, this China model couldn't be replicated. The reason is that there is a vibrant civil society, exerting restrictions on the behavior of the government, and playing an important role in protecting civil liberties and individual rights. This is why we have seen, when Chinese state-owned enterprises making, investment in African countries under the, huge policy frame of One Belt, One Road, they encountered a lot of local resistance from, local populations, NGOs, and the politicians. They simply couldn't adopt the same model they used in China to generate the same kind of a growth, to suppress the cost of labor, to sacrifice the environment, to expropriate the land, and to generate profits and growth. Right? But on the other hand, we do see that the Chinese government or the China model is being replicated, somewhere else. For example, I visited Southeast Asia a couple of times before, and 10 years ago, in many Southeast Asian countries, the government-backed land expropriation from rural landowners to make way for development. It's, you can't imagine this kind of a compulsory expropriation at all. But more recently, because these developing countries need to compete with China, which has a huge advantage, cost advantage, compared with these other developing countries, right? So like Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, Myanmar, they all actually, sacrifice their own civil rights and liberties a little bit to make their manufacturing more and more cost advantages, right? To have better cost advantage. Right? So this is a concern. Actually, for welfare states, it's difficult to compete with China on cutting costs, but rather they have to compete based on increase in productivity, in innovation, and the creation of higher value added. So the second part of the question is, how is this China model related with FDI? I mean, FDI started in China in 1980s and the 1990s. During those two decades, FDI played a key role in providing the necessary financial capital for the China model, because China has a lot of labor, has massive land to be occupied, to be used, but they didn't have enough financial capital at the very beginning. So that's why FDI was extremely important. They were provided with a lot of beneficial treatments, lower taxes, and a lot of other preferential treatments to make investment in China. But increasingly, what we see is that China, accumulated a lot of domestic financial capital already, and China is no longer as friendly as before towards FDIs. Right? We have seen many disputes occurred between Chinese government and the foreign companies from Europe and from the United States. So this has become a change we have observed over the past decade.
Thank you so much for your insights, Dr. Sun, and thank you to everyone who submitted questions. But unfortunately, we have run out of time. So I'm not sure, Dr. Sun, would you be willing to, answer questions by email at your own time, or it's up to you? I don't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah, my pleasure, yes.
Well, thank you so much.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sun, for this very
thank you
informative
everyone for
webinar
this.
China model.
Great, thank you, Anna.
Yeah, I think Dr. Sun, if you don't mind to stay on for a few more minutes, if anyone want to stay on the Zoom to say hi or chat with you, they're welcome to do so.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for joining us for this week's #GLOVicariously webinar. Please join us again to hear from another fantastic speaker next week on the topic of the art and science of achieving sustainable community development outcomes in internships and volunteer engagement. Enjoy the rest of the day and take care, and thanks.